Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first of all, we're going to start with Avdiivka. Today, the Russian sources reported that the Western intelligence managed to discover the Russian plans to get more details about this operation, and the secret title of this Avdiivka offensive operation, according to the Russian classification, has the title of Avdiivka Noose. So the main purpose of this attack, as we discussed, as we understand from the title of this area, is to force and to push the Russian forces from the north and from the south on the line between Berdichi and Tonika. So this is the news that the Russians are going to make less and less, because obviously we understand that it's highly unlikely the Russians are able to storm the city of Avdiivka itself by attacking, let's say, from the cities like Opytne or from the city like Spartak or Kruta Balka, because this is a very well fortified area, and the fortifications in this area has been built since the beginning of the operation in Donbass in 2014. So there are a lot of trenches, lots of underground facilities, and it's impossible. Furthermore, the sources are saying that there are around 4 fully blooded brigades. There is like 36 brigades, as we discussed. There is 53rd Brigade. There is a 116th Defense Brigade. There is also, we can find 110th Mechanized Brigade. A lot of forces, in the sources are saying that there are around up to 15,000 of soldiers. And the only possible that the Russians found is to attack the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Berdichi Stepova, and the second attack in direction of Toninka, and basically to create this news, Avdiivka news. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to do this or not, but today we got more details and more updates about the entire situation. And the most important updates are coming from the northern part of Avdiivka, from the area between the chemical plant and the landfill, this Terikon. As if you remember, during the morning video we discussed that as a result of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, the Russians were forced to step back from this landfill, but yet we haven't received even a single video or photo confirmation of that counterattack. So maybe it's true, maybe it's not like a real situation, who knows, but this is the situation with this area. But the Russian sources, for example, later published another update, and the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes during the day, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt exactly in the vicinity of the chemical plant, and basically the Russians managed to enter the chemical plant from direction of Berdichi along the railways. So, and according to that source, currently the Russians are making something like a clearing operation and trying to dig in deeper exactly in this part of Avdiivka. Very difficult to understand how exactly the Russians managed to implement this operation, but we'll see, because if this piece of news is correct, if there is no if it's like a real update, that means that we can start counting days before Avdiivka will be encircled completely and will collapse. Obviously, it is very difficult to continue defense of this area without having control over the chemical plant. The most important benefit and value of the chemical plant is that who controls chemical plant controls the main supply roads that goes from Avdiivka through Lastochkina in direction of Orlovka and further in direction of the mainland. And if the Russians captured this territory, obviously they have already cut the main supply, one of the main supply roads that Ukrainians have. Furthermore, don't forget that as a result of fierce clashes on the southern direction, the Russians have already established physical and fire control over the second supply road that goes from Toninka Severna to Avdiivka. So this road also was cut off by the Russians. And the only possible solution that Ukrainians still have is to use the road from Avdiivka, Lastochkina, Orlovka. But this area is located very close to the Russian forces. The Russians do have fire control, physical control from many directions. From the south, obviously, the Russians have control over this territory from the north, and I believe that Ukrainians' losses on this road is around let's say 70 or even 90% if they use this road. Obviously, even when talking about the current Russian artillery pressure, maybe the loss is even higher. During the previous night, as we discussed in the previous video, the Russians were attacking this territory with one purpose, trying not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy their forces from one part of Avdiivka to another, and basically not to allow the Ukrainians to send reinforcement from the southern part of Avdiivka to the north in direction of chemical plant. And of course, probably all those attacks gave significant benefits, and the most important in this battle, that those attacks gave the Russian time to dig in deeper on the Ukrainian side of the railways. Furthermore, during the previous nights and day, the Russians were bombing and attacking the Avdiivka in the central part and the southern part, yet they haven't started any offensive operation, which is very interesting from the eastern direction. But maybe the main reason of that is that this area is very well fortified by the Ukrainians, and basically this would be something like a suicide operation to attack in this direction. But the Russians are using a lot of weapons. For example, in this video we see how the Russians were using the self-guided missile, and as a result of strike of that self-guided missile, the Russians managed to destroy position of Ukrainian forces in the western part, in the eastern part of Avdiivka. Furthermore, as we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians tried to concentrate their forces on the northern part in the vicinity of Achertina, but the things goes very bad for the Ukrainians. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that as a result of usage of the railway station, the Ukrainians tried to concentrate forces, but the Russians managed to discover the positions of 31st Mechanized Brigade, and as a result of Iskander strike, the Ukraine lost up to 90 soldiers and 10 armored vehicles. After that, the Ukrainians realized that highly unlikely they have chances to concentrate forces very close to the combat line, and they took a decision to move their concentration area, the main logistic area, in direction of Pokrovsk or Krasnoarmeysk. The Russian sources also published the first confirmations. There were no video confirmations, just photo and message confirmations, that during the previous day the Russians made at least 2 missile strikes against Pokrovsk, and as a result of those strikes, very big buildings were destroyed. The buildings that Ukrainians were using for concentration of Ukrainian forces, for positions and so on. So we see that Ukrainians do have problems with concentrating, and currently they haven't started any counter-offensive operation, and the main reason of that, they don't have operational reserves to make this operation. When talking about the northern part of Avdiivka, we got few details, few geolocations from this territory, which we have already discussed in the previous video. The most important area that we need to pay attention to is the area between Krasnogorovka and the towns and cities and villages on the north by the name of Novokalinova and Keramik. There are very fierce clashes along the railways. The very close and stick positions between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians controls this tree line, this one. The Russians control the tree line below the railway tracks, and currently there are very fierce clashes, and as I understand, both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, try to reduce each other. The Ukrainians, for example, attacked the Russian with grenades and a lot of, probably with FPV drones, with bombings. The Russians were trying to destroy the Ukrainian strongholds and the shelters along the railways. Currently very difficult to understand whether they managed to achieve some success, but both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, expect some strike from the south and from the north. And basically they just want to be secured and just want to stay on the safe side, because currently this is the most important area for the Russians, exactly the area along the railways. Because, for example, the Ukrainian sources published the video that's how the Russian support machine was heading from Krasnogorovka to Berdichi, and as you can see, according to information we had, this territory was under complete Russian control as a result of attack, but something went wrong, and basically the Ukrainians had access to this territory, and they sent reconnaissance team, and as a result of attack of reconnaissance team against the Russian armored vehicle, the Russians lost another armored personal carrier with infantry probably on board, or maybe that was support machine. So as you can see, there are problems, and before continue any offensive operation further in Berdichi, first of all the Russians need to secure their northern flank, the area along the railways. And as I understand, they were pretty focused to complete this operation, this reinforcement operation during the previous 24 hours. When talking about the southern direction, we haven't received nothing. We have received nothing from Severny area, just a few updates about Russian offensive operation in direction of Pervomaiske. And as a result of that attack, according to information we have, the Russians managed to establish control over more tree lines, and basically they got closer to the Ukrainian positions, and to be more precise, they got closer to the position in the city by the name of Nivoyska. If you remember, during the previous day, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation in Pervomaiske, managed to establish control over more positions on the northwestern part of Pervomaiske. We saw the video of Russian attack, but we didn't have any confirmation whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper and to establish full control over this territory. But today we got the proofs from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the positions that were recently captured by the Russian forces. The Ukrainians were using that multi-launch rocket systems, cluster rounds, all types of weapons they have, just to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to develop their offensive operation further. So basically that Russian offensive operation that took place yesterday was pretty successful, and as a result of that attack they managed to establish control over more territories on the west of Opotne. More clashes are taking place in Novomikhailivka. The Russians are trying to dig in deeper on the southern area of the city, and the Russians are trying to develop their positions on the northern part of Novomikhailivka, and I expect that probably in a week, not earlier, but in a week or maybe in 2 weeks, the Russians will launch an offensive operation in Novomikhailivka from the north and from the south, obviously, and of course the Russians will launch attack from the east. During the next 2 weeks, the Russians will try to complete the clearing operation of the minefields and fortifications that Ukrainians have on the north of Novomikhailivka. During the day, the Russians continue suppressing Ukrainian positions using the Ilmur missiles and self-guided missiles, and as a result of strikes, a lot of Ukrainian ammo depots and positions were destroyed. Also, the Russians managed to discover a few tank and artillery hidden positions on the south of Novomikhailivka, and as a result of artillery strikes, all those positions also were destroyed under Russian heavy fire. So the Russians continue suppressing, they continue attack. After attack, the Russians continue discovering Ukrainian positions, and after the Russians discover, they destroy everything on their way, trying to reduce and to suppress Russian long-range and middle-range artillery systems. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost not anything. We have received almost nothing from this direction. Just Ukrainians published the video how they managed to discover the Russian artillery position, hidden position, and as a result of FPV drone strike, like the Russian Sta-S self-propelled howitzer was destroyed, and there was a very powerful explosion. Unprotected howitzer was destroyed as a result of strike of a very cheap FPV drone, Ukrainian FPV drone. Now we're moving to Zaporizhia direction. Today we got also a lot of updates from this territory. As you can see, I have updated the map on the south. The Russians, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to maintain the Ukraine to take back positions that they lost during the offensive operation of 46 Air Mobile Brigade. Currently, this brigade was forced to step back further deep inside of the fields between Verbova and Rabotina, but the Russians are not planning to stop. Obviously, they will continue offensive operation from the south, trying to cut this territory in two pieces, like Rabotina and Verbova. And also the Russians started artillery preparation against the north and top Rabotina Verbova positions, and I expect another offensive operation in this direction, and probably the Russians will try to encircle some forces in this area as well. Currently, maybe this operation has other purposes, and probably the most important purposes of these attacks is to force the Ukrainians to keep reserves in this area, because if the Russians want to be successful in Avdiivka, first of all, they need to force the Ukrainians to keep their reserves on every single direction, on Kupinsk, Zaporizhia, Liman, and not to allow them to redeploy them to Avdiivka. And if the Russians, and to do this, first of all, the Russians need always to attack, no matter the losses, no matter the problems they can face during all these attacks. For example, on Orekhov direction, the Russians were attacking the tree lines, the Ukrainian positions with the different types of weapons, including TOS flamethrower systems, including multi-launch rocket systems. As a result of those strikes, we see the damage that the Russians managed to deal, and we see the losses, and probably the losses as a result of those attacks were very heavy. At least the Russians managed to destroy a few ammo depots as a result of secondary detonation. More losses, more updates and more losses the Ukrainians are having in front of Verbova. Currently, the forces of 82nd Brigade or 71st Jaeger basically were left in this area and the only thing they can count on is the luck and destiny, and that the destiny is going to be very good with them, because nobody helped them, nobody gave them like weapon, and the most important, nobody is going to evacuate them. It is very easy to enter Rabotino-Verbovo field, but probably it is very difficult to leave this territory. So we can say that leave every hope, you who enter Verbovo-Rabotino fields. The Russians continue bombing and destroying and reducing to ruins the positions of Ukrainians in the vicinity of Rabotino itself. And according even to the Ukrainian authorities, the city, the Rabotino village, is no longer under complete Ukrainian control. Just the northern part is under Ukrainian control, and the central and the southern part are in the gray zone, or even partly under Russian control. Very interesting details now these are coming from the area between Kopony and Novodanilovka, Novoandreevka. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians continue concentration of their forces to start. Maybe they want to try their luck in this direction by attacking in direction of Nistirianka and by attacks in direction of Kopony. I don't know, but today we got very interesting video of Ukrainian offensive operation, small local offensive operation. The Ukrainians were using just a tank and like an infantry, just one tank and one personal carrier, probably up to 20 stormtroopers. And as a result of this very small and local offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt, and under protection and support of tank fire, the Ukrainians basically captured one of the biggest and one of the most powerful strongholds in this direction. I was very surprised when I was watching this video, because the Russians haven't sent any like armored support to this area. So basically they just missed that strike and they lost the battle for these trenches. The Russian soldiers, because they didn't have any possibility to fight against tanks, took a decision to step back, and later we see how the Ukrainians were moving between trenches and so on. Later the Russian sources published the video of FPV drone strikes, but those were the strikes already against the trenches that were captured by the Ukrainians. So somehow the Russians missed that attack and they lost a very powerful stronghold. Now they need to try to return it back or something like this. But it's very difficult to understand whether they are ready to do this or not. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian concentrations in Novoandreevka. So as you can see, when talking about Zaporizhia direction, currently this area is number one, is primary target for the Ukrainians. And now we'll see whether they are able to do anything in this direction or not. When talking about Kupiansk and Liman direction, we haven't received almost nothing from these two territories. No losses, no videos of losses, no geolocations, just artillery bombings and clashes of Ukrainian positions in Petropavlovka. So the Russians continue suppressing the Ukrainian positions, and we understand that the Russians in Kupiansk have the same purposes and goals as the Russians in Rabotino and so on, to force the Ukrainians to keep their reserves here. And if the Russians see that Ukrainians started redeployment of strategic reserves, they will launch attack, no matter the losses and no matter whether they are able to get results or not. The most important thing they need is to force the Ukrainians not to use reserves and to fight in Avdiivka with the local and operational reserves they have as long as possible. Obviously, sooner or later the Ukrainians will find reserves for Avdiivka battle, and the most important goal for the Russians is to make the situation when the Ukrainians find these reserves, but not very soon. Let's say as far as possible from the current date. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to do this or not. When talking about Bakhmut, no changes, just FPV drone strikes against each other. And the interesting video we got is how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions along the railways, which confirms that Ukrainians still haven't managed to cross this territory. The Ukrainians established fire control over the Russian positions in Bakhmut, and during the previous day they published a lot of videos how they destroyed at least 3 armored vehicles of Russian forces in Bakhmut, and maybe this is another preparation before the next waves of attack. But if you ask my opinion, I don't see any resources of Ukrainian forces to start any operation, because most of their forces should be involved and concentrated in Avdiivka with one purpose: to save control over this territory, no matter the losses that they can have as a result of the, let's say, the Russian offensive operation. So we'll see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.